Imagine designing a policy specifically to protect American workers and strengthen American industry, and instead watching home prices spike, construction sites go quiet, and the very country you were trying to pressure walk away stronger than before. That is not a hypothetical. That is exactly what happened when Washington placed sweeping tariffs on Canadian lumber. What was framed as economic self-defense turned into one of the most consequential, unforced errors in recent American trade history. And the people who paid the heaviest price weren't Canadian lumber executives. They were American families trying to buy homes. This is the full story of how that happened, what it cost, and why Canada came out of it in a position nobody predicted. To understand why lumber tariffs hit so hard and so fast, you need to understand one number: 1/3. The United States imports approximately 1/3 of all the lumber it consumes. That's not a rounding error or a supply gap that can be patched with extra domestic production. It is a structural feature of the American construction economy, baked into the supply chains of every major builder, every renovation contractor, and every housing development across the country. And of that imported lumber, roughly 85% comes from a single source: Canada. Softwood lumber from British Columbia, Alberta, and Ontario has been flowing into American construction markets for generations. It builds the homes in Texas suburbs, the apartment complexes going up in Florida, the single-family developments expanding across Ohio. It is so deeply woven into American construction that most home builders never thought to question where their materials came from, because it was never a question worth asking. The supply was reliable, the pricing was predictable, and the partnership worked. Then, Washington decided the partnership was the problem. When President Trump declared that the United States didn't need Canadian lumber and backed that declaration with new national security tariffs on imported softwood, the political message was clear: buy American, build American, stop depending on Canada. The economic reality that followed told a very different story. Within days of the tariffs taking effect, lumber markets reacted in a way that should have been entirely predictable to anyone who had looked at the underlying supply data. Prices surged past $650 per thousand board feet, the highest level in years, and kept climbing. By mid-2025, the benchmark had pushed towards $765 per thousand board feet, a level that sent shockwaves through every sector that touches construction. The reason was straightforward, even if the policy architects seemed unprepared for it. Canada supplies approximately 12 billion board feet of softwood lumber to American markets every year, close to a quarter of total national demand. Replacing that volume domestically wasn't a matter of political will or industrial ambition. It was a matter of physical capacity, and the capacity wasn't there. Most American sawmills were already operating at roughly 95% of their maximum output before the tariffs arrived. There was no idle capacity sitting in reserve, waiting to be activated by a price signal. The mills that existed were running nearly as hard as they could run, limited by aging equipment, chronic workforce shortages, and the long lead times required to bring new timber processing infrastructure online. Industry specialists with no political stake in the outcome were consistent in their assessment, even under the most optimistic assumptions: record capital investment, full staffing, entirely new mill construction. Replacing Canada's share of American lumber supply would take the better part of a decade. A decade for a housing market that needed materials this quarter. The consequences moved through the construction economy with a speed and severity that analysts at the Brookings Institution and the National Association of Home Builders had warned about before the tariffs were finalized. Every $10,000 increase in the cost of building a new home, a threshold lumber price increases we're pushing past in many markets, is estimated to price millions of American households out of home ownership entirely. Not discourage them, price them out. Move the possibility of owning a home from difficult to mathematically impossible for a significant share of the working and middle class. Builders across Texas, Florida, and Ohio began delaying projects they couldn't pencil out at the new material costs. Some developments were restructured, others were abandoned. The construction workers whose jobs the tariff policy was nominally designed to protect found themselves with fewer projects to work on, not more. The National Association of Home Builders calculated the damage with precision. For every 1% increase in lumber prices, the cost of building a new home rises by more than $1,000. With prices up tens of percentage points from pre-tariff levels, that translated into five-figure cost increases on homes that hadn't changed in size, design, or quality, just price. Here is where the story takes a turn that most coverage missed entirely, because it requires looking north rather than south. When the tariffs landed, the conventional expectation was that Canada would either retaliate in kind, matching American duties with Canadian ones, or absorb the damage and wait for Washington to reconsider. Ottawa chose neither. What Prime Minister Mark Carney's government chose instead was considerably more strategically significant. It used the crisis as a forcing function to do something the Canadian lumber industry had needed to do for decades but had never had sufficient urgency to attempt. It diversified. The federal government committed $500 million to help Canadian softwood producers redirect their exports away from the American market and toward international buyers. Shortly after, an additional $1.2 billion Canadian, approximately $870 million US, was committed to protect the sector from anti-dumping duties and build a more competitive foundation for global trade. British Columbia's Minister of Forests set a specific, measurable target: redirect at least 10% of Canadian lumber exports away from the United States and into new markets within a defined timeline. What followed was a systematic, government-backed push into markets that Canadian producers had previously treated as secondary opportunities at best. South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, India, Australia, the United Kingdom, Germany, and markets across the Middle East and North Africa all became active targets for Canadian trade missions and long-term supply agreements. Japan, historically a secondary customer, increased its Canadian lumber imports by roughly 26% in early 2024. A signal of confidence in Canada's reliability as a supplier that reverberated through other Asian markets. Trade agreements deepened with Germany and South Korea, extending Canada's footprint into markets where sustainable certified forestry practices were becoming purchasing requirements rather than optional preferences. At home, major Canadian forestry and logistics companies accelerated investment in port infrastructure at Vancouver and Prince Rupert, the two primary gateways for Pacific trade, to handle the rising volume of global shipments. Mills in British Columbia and Alberta began shifting their production mix away from commodity softwood toward higher-value processed products, engineered timber, furniture-grade wood, specialized construction materials that command better margins and stronger buyer loyalty than raw lumber exports. By 2025, Canadian companies had grown their shipments outside the United States by nearly 20%. That number represented more than a trade statistic. It represented a fundamental change in how Canada's lumber industry understood itself and its place in the global economy. According to RBC analysts, if current trends continue, Canada could become the largest lumber export hub outside Northern Europe by 2027, a projection that would have seemed improbable before the tariffs created the pressure that accelerated the transformation. The competitive irony. There is a painful irony embedded in what happened next that no policy model had accounted for. The tariffs Washington imposed on Canadian lumber were designed to reduce Canadian competitiveness in the American market. Instead, by driving lumber prices higher globally, they increased the revenue Canadian producers were collecting on every board foot they sold, including to non-American buyers. That additional revenue funded the exact investments in technology, infrastructure, and market expansion that made Canadian producers more competitive globally, not less. Major Canadian forestry companies, including West Fraser, Canfor, and Interfor, used the elevated pricing environment to finance upgrades to their operations, expand into premium product categories, and deepen relationships with international buyers who valued the combination of sustainable forest management practices and consistent supply reliability that Canadian producers offered. The tariffs intended to weaken Canada's position in the lumber trade ended up accelerating its transformation into a more diversified, more globally integrated, and more strategically independent industry than it had been before. The policy worked precisely as designed inside the United States. It made Canadian lumber more expensive for American buyers. What it couldn't control was what Canada did with the economic space that created. Meanwhile, the promised renaissance in American domestic lumber production never materialized. Domestic mills remained constrained by the same structural factors that existed before the tariffs: outdated equipment, labor shortages, and the years-long timeline required to bring meaningful new capacity online. The protection the tariffs provided did not translate into accelerated investment or expanded output at the scale the policy's architects had projected. By mid-2025, economists who had tracked the policy from its introduction were offering a consistent assessment. Rather than securing American jobs and strengthening the domestic forestry sector, the tariff strategy had created bottlenecks, inflated costs for builders and families, and delivered a competitive advantage to international suppliers, including Canada, operating in markets where the tariffs had no effect. Lumber had become a case study in an economic principle that protectionist trade policy consistently struggles to overcome. When a domestic industry lacks the physical capacity to replace what it's shutting out, the primary effect of the barrier isn't to grow the domestic industry, it's to raise prices for domestic consumers. The housing affordability crisis, the human cost. It is worth being specific about what this meant for ordinary American families, because the discussion of tariff policy can become abstract in ways that obscure the concrete human impact. Housing affordability in the United States was already under significant stress before the lumber tariffs arrived. Decades of underbuilding relative to household formation, combined with interest rate increases through the early 2020s, had pushed homeownership out of reach for a growing share of middle-income Americans. The lumber tariffs did not create that crisis, but they accelerated it, and they did so in the most direct possible way, by raising the cost of the primary material used to build the homes that weren't being built fast enough to begin with. Every percentage point increase in lumber prices added more than $1,000 to the construction cost of a new home. At the price levels reached by mid-2025, that translated to more than $10,000 in added cost per unit, with no improvement in the home itself. No better materials, no superior design, no additional square footage. Just higher costs passed through to buyers who were already stretching to qualify for mortgages at elevated interest rates. Analysts at Brookings were direct in their assessment. Lumber tariffs don't protect the construction industry. They make housing less affordable for working Americans. The builders who were supposed to benefit from a protected supply chain were, in many cases, the same businesses being squeezed by the rising costs that protection created. The families who were supposed to benefit from job-protecting policy found themselves priced out of the housing market by the downstream effects of that policy. Half-built developments sat waiting for materials or financing adjustments that allowed projects to move forward at the new cost structure. First-time buyers in Texas, Ohio, Florida, and across the country recalculated what they could afford and found the number had changed in ways that had nothing to do with their own financial situations and everything to do with decisions made in Washington. The lumber tariff story is, at its core, a story about economic complexity resisting political simplicity. The instinct behind the policy was straightforward. Protect American industry, reduce dependence on Canadian supply, strengthen domestic production. Those are defensible goals. The problem wasn't the objective. The problem was the assumption that the domestic industry had the capacity to respond quickly enough to fill the gap, and that the country being pressured would absorb the impact rather than adapt around it. Canada adapted, faster, more completely, and more strategically than most observers anticipated. The pressure that was meant to create vulnerability instead created urgency. And urgency, when paired with government support and a clear strategic direction, produced one of the more significant industrial transformations in Canadian forestry in a generation. British Columbia and Alberta, which had spent decades oriented almost entirely toward the American market, emerged from this period more globally diversified, more technologically advanced, and more financially resilient than they entered it. The United States, by contrast, enters this next phase of the trade relationship with a housing market that is more strained, a domestic lumber industry that is no more capable than it was before the tariffs were imposed, and supply chain relationships that have been complicated without being replaced. None of this means trade policy is inherently counterproductive. It means that trade policy disconnected from supply reality carries costs, and those costs tend to land on the consumers and businesses that were never the intended targets of the policy in the first place. The North American lumber trade has been fundamentally realigned. Canada is no longer the supplier that exists primarily to serve American housing demand. It is becoming an independent global player, building relationships across Asia, Europe, and emerging markets that will continue to develop regardless of what happens in bilateral negotiations with Washington. That shift didn't happen because of Canadian strategic brilliance alone. It happened because American trade policy created the conditions that made it necessary, and Canada had the institutional capacity and the government support to respond effectively. For American families still navigating an unaffordable housing market, that is a complicated story to sit with. The policy that was supposed to make things better made things harder, and the country it was supposed to pressure is, by most measures, in a stronger global position than when the tariffs were first announced. What do you think? Is there a version of lumber trade policy that actually achieves the stated goal of protecting American jobs without pricing families out of homeownership? Or is this a case where the supply dependency was simply too deep to change through tariff pressure alone? Drop your perspective in the comments. If this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of something that affects housing costs across the US, share it. There are homebuyers, builders, and policymakers across America and Canada who are living the consequences of these decisions and deserve to understand them clearly. This video presents economic analysis based on publicly available trade data, industry reporting, and commentary from research institutions, including Brookings and the National Association of Home Builders. It reflects the situation as understood through 2025 and early 2026 and does not constitute financial or investment advice.